Hey guys, welcome back to Fat History. If you're new here, it's where we talk about cool fat people throughout history. Fat people have always existed and we've always done cool and interesting things. Our stories just never get told right. So I'm here to tell those stories with dignity and respect. Today's episode is going to be just a little bit different. Instead of talking about just one person, we're going to be talking about a group of people, and that is fat men's clubs. These clubs could be described as marking the end of the last time that living in a fat body was truly celebrated by society. It's definitely an interesting story and it has a bit of nuance to it. If you've never heard it, I would love to share their story with you. So let's get started. Fat men's clubs are made up of self-identified fat men who are wealthy, usually powerful, and exclusively white. Their clubs usually had names like the New England Fat Men's Club, the Jolly Fat Men's Club, the United Association of the Heavy Men of New York State, the Fat Men's Beneficial Association, and the Heavyweights. You might be thinking, surely there was fat women's clubs too, right? And yes, they did exist, but their membership was super low in comparison, and they were highly criticized by the male-dominated press. They would say things like, fat men may be popular, but the fat woman is always awkward. The farthest back mention I could find of a fat men's club was in 1867 when Smith Barnum, who is a cousin of P.T. Barnum, like of Barnum and Bailey, like the circus dude, and Sidney Smith held a picnic to raise money for their friend's hotel that wasn't doing well financially. The first picnic was super successful, and that would mark the beginning of the first Fat Men's Association. The New York Fat Men's Association would be created as a sister organization a few years later. They sent out clam bake invitations to fat men in New York City and Brooklyn, which, how did they find them? You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure that they were already people that they knew from their social circle, but I like to imagine that they would follow fat men home to get their address and then send them invitations, and they would be like, who sent this? I could go for a clam bake, though. To pay for the cost of the steamer and food, they raised funds by hosting the Fat Men's Ball. Tickets were sold to the public, who watched from galleries above the dance floor. The club's mantra was, we're fat and making the most of it. And their motto was, I've got to be good-natured. I can't fight and I can't run. By the beginning of the 1900s, there was clubs in every state in the Union and in the nation's capital. They also popped up in places like Britain, Serbia, and France. So it wasn't necessarily just an American thing. The rules varied by club. Like, one of the clubs had a rule that any member caught eating a notoriously stinky Limburger cheese had to treat the entire club. But typically to join, it would be things like pay $1 fee, not be a woman or person of color, learn a secret handshake, and most importantly, be over 200 or sometimes 250 pounds. And you better not try to get around that rule because they would be checking with regular weigh-ins. Some clubs would even go as far as to make you pay a fee if you didn't meet the weight requirements. When it comes to the fee, it was more about raising money for their events than it was actually about punishment, though. The club's purpose, according to one of the presidents, was to draw fat men into closer fraternal relations. The biggest draw to being in a fat men's club was that it was a status symbol. The exclusivity gave you access to some of the most powerful people in your community. For example, in New York, some of the members included people like the superintendent of the Brooklyn Waterworks, the inspector of sewers, the keeper of the Kings County Penitentiary, lawyers, contractors, and NYPD sergeants and captains. And in Texas, some of the members included people who worked in gold mining, railroad presidents, butchers, and liquor dealers. Even President Taft was a guest of honor at a meeting. At his request, for dinner they had possum and taters. Ew. Didn't end up joining a club, but he would attend a few meetings as a guest. When it comes to what they actually did at these meetings, they would start with a customary weigh-in where prizes and honorary titles were given to the heaviest members. Sometimes people would even go as far as to stuff their jacket or hide rocks in their pockets to give themselves a higher, more honorable weight. After the weigh-in, they would have big fancy dinners that would last all night long. Another big aspect is that they had a lot of parties, picnics, banquets, and clam bakes. So many clam bakes. I don't know if this was just like a cultural thing at the time or like what was up with it, but I saw so many stories of clubs having clam bakes. Am I missing something? Is that like a thing that was like popular at the time? Like, there was a lot of mention of clam bakes. If anyone knows what that's about, please let me know. It was said that at one of the events, the menu included
one 9-course meal including oyster cocktail, cream of chicken soup, boiled snapper, fillet of beef with mushrooms, roast chicken, roast suckling pig, shrimp salad, steamed fruit pudding with brandy sauce, assorted cakes, cheese, ice cream, followed by coffee and cigars.
At one of their banquets that had gone on till midnight, it was said the only men leaving the table were those that feared apoplexy. The Fat Men's Club scene was especially popular in DC. They had annual outings on the river where they would picnic, barbecue, and play various games. Their third trip in the summer of 1893 was especially spectacular. They had 3 steamers that were chartered for the event and made 7 trips transporting 6,200 people. They had competitive athletic events that were mostly only open to fat men. They included things like foot races, 3-legged races, dancing, and leapfrog competitions. They also had a lot of sports teams. For example, there was a baseball team in Waterloo, Iowa called the Fat Men's Amusement Company, and it was made up of only Fat Men's Club members. Another thing they liked to do was eating contests. Now, they're not where eating contests started, but I can guarantee they tried to perfect it. When the Manhattan Club hosted an all-you-can-eat contest, Frank Dolter, who's a 380-pound alderman, ate 275 oysters, 8 pounds of steaks, 12 rolls, 11 cups of coffee, and 3 pies. How? The prize was $50, which in today's money is over $1,600, by the way. Overall, the clubs are mainly based around the idea of fat men connecting and networking, but I did find a few instances of conflict within the clubs too. The Jolly Fat Men's Club and the Fat Men's Beneficiary Association had beef. They had originally been just one group, but they broke up because of a financial dispute, and then they ended up scheduling their annual barbecue on the same day. They ended up all fighting because they couldn't figure out who should set their picnic up where. On another occasion, one of the clubs was busted for selling beer on Sunday, which was super illegal at the time because of, prohibition. The police raided the headquarters only to find 8 officers, 3 of which were in uniform, drinking with the rest of the club. Overall, it's pretty much what you would expect when you hear the name Fat Men's Club. It was fat dudes hanging out, drinking, eating, having fun, and making business connections. So now that we have a good idea of what the clubs are and what they did, let's talk about how they were treated. There were 2 main ideas that people had at the time about fat people, and specifically fat men. For about 400 years, between 1500 and 1900, body weight and volume had strong visual appeal. Of course, there were variations by country and century standards of beauty, but in general, it was considered not only just beautiful, but natural to look physically substantial. Being fat was often seen as a sign of health and wealth because it meant that you were free from disease before the invention of antibiotics, and not only that you had access to food, but that you had access to plenty of food regularly. In an 1884 New York Times article titled "The Glory of Adipose," the author talks about one of the presidents of a club. He says, Philetus Dorlin, which is a wild name by the way, Philetus Dorlin was an imposing figure. His obesity borders on infinite. The most hardened and lean man cannot gaze upon his magnificent proportions without being unconsciously made purer and more holy. There was this idea that fat men, by nature, were better tempered and more kindly. A newspaper in 1899 ran an article about why women should date fat men. It says, "It may be observed without any intentional offense to any young lady who might be enamored by some skeleton-like young man, that as a rule, fat men, besides being the most jolly and convivial of the male species, are also apt to being the most considerate of and charitable to others. The fact still remains that 7 out of 10 fat men make excellent husbands." While I find it hard to believe that 7 out of any 10 men make excellent husbands, it is a good example of positive ways people viewed larger bodies before weight stigma became so normalized. While the jolly fat man is a cherished archetype, its total opposite was just as prevalent at the time. Fat men were associated with wealth and affability, which can be seen as a positive thing to an extent, but you can definitely see the more negative connotations in terms like fat cat and robber baron. The term robber baron came into circulation during the late 19th century. This was applied to tycoons who used exploitative practices in building massive amounts of wealth. They were brutal monopolists who earned their profits by intentionally restricting the production of goods, then raising the prices on them. This contributed heavily towards a view that fat people are greedy and worthy of disgust. As time went on, being fat acquired more and more stigma. Many clubs, while not outright ridiculed, were covered in a mocking tone by the press. For example, a newspaper devoted several inches of print space to report on a Fat Men's Club member who ripped his pants during a bike race. In the late 1800s, some civil service jobs started refusing to hire fat people because they thought of them as lazy. In 1908, police force policies would require that applicants weigh no more than 250 pounds. And by 1916, excessive obesity became a disqualifier for anyone applying to civil service jobs in New York. This type of discrimination would actually be allowed to continue all the way up until this year. In fact, a few weeks ago, in May of 2023, New York just passed a law banning weight-based discrimination for jobs and housing. It is truly wild that it took over 100 years for that to get corrected, but I'm shocked and very happy that it did. By the 1920s, doctors and insurance companies started raising awareness for the long-term health effects of obesity. That really turned the public's perception of body weight. Another aspect that really helped in pushing fatphobic ideology was white supremacy ideology. There's this article called The Racial Origins of Fat Stigma. I highly recommend going to check out the full article. It is really informative. I'm gonna read a little bit from it directly right now because it really words it really perfectly. The Protestant ethic, initially coined by sociologist Max Weber in 1904, describes the concept of hard work and self-discipline as highly valued traits that would lead to eternal salvation. The mortification of the flesh, or the act of putting sins related to the body to death by abstaining from certain pleasures, is a common concept for all Christian denominations, reflected in practices like fasting or abstinence. Many of these ideas were taken up by Anglo-Saxon Protestants in the US in the 19th century. What they wanted to do was show that they were both morally upright and racially proper in the way in which they ate and how they maintained their figure. There was this cultural push to use your body as a demonstration and display of white Christian values. As medical and cultural attitudes shifted, memberships dropped rapidly. Fat men's clubs all across the country disappeared virtually overnight. By 1924, the New England Fat Men's Club, which once had over 10,000 members, was down to only 38. Their 1925 outing would be their last. And they would leave us with this toast. A toast to us, my good kind friends, to bless the things we eat. For it has been full many a year since we have seen our feet. But who would lose a precious pound by trading sweets for sours? It takes a mighty girth indeed to hold such hearts as ours. There's a lot to be said about fat men's clubs, and again, they can be described as marking the end of the last time that fat bodies were truly celebrated by society. And even though it was mostly just white men who were given that grace, I feel like the point still stands. I feel like we've definitely come a long way, but even within plus size spaces, there is a lot of work to be done. We are just now to the point in society where being okay, or God forbid, happy with your fat body is acceptable. Is that the general consensus? Absolutely not. Do I think these clubs could ever exist again in the same capacity? Absolutely not. There's so many sociological factors that went into them being possible that I think would simply not work in today's society. These clubs functioned as a way of connecting powerful white men who happen to be fat. There's definitely a lot to be said about the sexism and racism that without question existed within these clubs. While I don't think that we should look to them as our moral compass, they are still a part of fat history, and learning about them deepens our understanding of what it meant to live in a fat body at that time in history, and the ways it's affected how people view body size today. From being loved and wildly popular to being snuffed out almost overnight, Fat Men's Clubs provide us a peek into a time when some fat bodies were truly celebrated. If this was your first time hearing their story, I am so thankful that I got to share it with you. I told you guys it was going to be interesting but nuanced. Let me know in the comments how you feel about it. As always, I really appreciate you guys being here, and I look forward to bringing more stories like these to you. I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone how the internet works. Feel free to subscribe if you like content like this, and if you want to get updated on when I post, there is a notification bell somewhere. Until next time, goodbye, guys. Hell yeah. Be ready to go. I'm ready to go right now. Later, the New York... I don't think that this is even funny enough to add because it is really stressing me out. The rules of the club, they vary. They vary. Butchers and liquid dealer. Pure. That can't be how you say that. What the hell? And so... This was a plot. Damn! Some civil service jobs. I hate talking about men. Girl, what the hell is this sentence? Girl, you are so cringy. I hate it. What's wrong with you? You need sleep, that's what. Oh, get out of here. You're so annoying.